one of everybody's favorite passages tonight in Genesis chapter 6. Basically, we've had creation, the fall. We talked about the Toledotes, this section. We're in the middle of the Adam Toledotes. This is the generations of Adam. Chapter 6, verse 9. So starting next week, we pick up with the generations of Noah, his story, which basically is the flood account. And a lot of what we're seeing is just the continuation of the human race as it develops in its relationship with God. Chapter 6, just kind of an introduction, chapter 6 kind of is an introduction. The key items we're going to talk about are what are the sons of God and the daughters of women. That is certainly the most debated topic in the chapter. What about the Nephilim or the giants or the Anakim? We'll talk about that. And then the idea in verse 3 that man's years will be 120. And so we've got three incredibly difficult topics in 8 verses. It's just, if there's a concentrated part of the Bible that has tons of discussion and is hard to understand, we are right there. So, now, well, let's just read 1 through 8, and then we'll come back as we talk about it in detail. When mankind began to multiply on earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful. They took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth, both in those days and afterwards, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind and bore children to them. They were powerful men of old, the famous men." When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, that every inclination of human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. We could spend an hour on verse 6. The idea that God can regret something. How, if you're all knowing, can you regret something? Anyway, then the Lord said, "I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and the birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them." Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. Grace is the better word there. It drives me. There's CSB. I like a lot of it, and sometimes I just want to smack it. The word is grace. It should not be found favor. The word should be grace. It's the best word there. I mean, it's just, I don't know why these, anyway. Sometimes people outthink the room, and grace is the word there. And we'll talk about that when we get to it, assuming we get to it tonight, because that's the last verse. All right, so just remember, and I touched on this last week, chapters were added in the 13th century, and verses were added in the 16th century. So there is nothing inerrant about chapters and verses, or where we put in, like my Bible has the, I can't think of the word, but anyway, the little sections, what do they call it, Daniel? Pericope. Pericope. The pericopes.
Thank you, Dan.
Yes. Just got to ask for help and then it comes. The pericopes, those are clearly added in by man later on. So all of that stuff, that when we talk about inerrancy, we're talking about original language, original word. So chapters and verses are not inerrant. So that being said, and I talked about this a little bit last week, but I'll talk about it in detail today. Selhammer very much believes that 6:1 through 4 is the conclusion to chapter 5. It's kind of the summary of chapter 5. 5 through 8 then provide a transition until you get into verse 9 and finish up the genealogy of Adam. So an introduction, if it's an introduction, then the focus is on man's wickedness and the cause of the flood. So most people look at this as an introduction to the flood account. All right, because we've got it's chapter 6 along with the start of the flood account. And if we do that, then what's it introducing? This must be why God sent the flood, right? Because of the evil. So it's part of that evil that's going on 1 through 4. But as a summary of the preceding chapter, It's also, it serves as a reminder that the sons and daughters of Adam have greatly increased in number, married, and continued to have children. And so we're just, basically, life is just going on. The history of man is just going on. The generation is populating. The world is starting to gain people throughout.
So in this case, we'll be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. So part of what the argument, so if you look at the fall of man in chapter 24, right before the fall of man, there's a brief discussion on the theme of marriage. Right, it talks about men and women being married right before you get to the fall. 1 through 4, so if you were kind of bundling all that up, in 1 through 4, on the eve of the flood, so now there's also one that kind of works back into the theme of marriage. So it's like, if you take the fall as sinful man, and you take the flood as a response to sinful man, and the introduction of that, really 5 through 8, then it would make sense that this serves more as a summary and not part of the next story, much the way it was separated out a little bit earlier in Genesis. And one thing about Genesis is the way it tells stories, the way it overlaps, and the ways it does things are very repeated. And so a lot of times you can see themes developed in Genesis because of the way things are structured and repeated. It's incredibly structured book in that way. Verse 6:3 is the other part that is what does it mean by their days will be 120 years. Now, this is the first time that God has spoken since chapter 5, verse 2. We had verse 2, he was talking about he created male and female when they were created. He blessed them, called them mankind. So he called them man. So God spoke there, refers to man speaking there. Then here he's going to speak again. In 6:3, the second time, he calls them man, or mankind is the word used here. And so the emphasis on mankind as a whole. So again, it looks like this beginning of chapter 6, now you can kind of bookend it with how the first of chapter 5 started, and you keep that as one unit. And again, so if it's one unit, then the emphasis is not on why is the flood coming. Now the other challenge is, what does it mean by the man will be 120 years? And so there's two basic camps with this. One is that means man's life is going to be 120 years. That'd be not exactly, but that's about how long a man lived. Now, the challenge with that is, when we get to our next genealogy, we see other genealogies in Genesis, people live over 120 years. So if God says from this moment forward, man's going to live 120 years, then how are people living over 120 years? So how can it refer to how long is man going to live? However, if I look at the structure of the entire Pentateuch and treat the Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, as one book, which I would argue is the best way to treat that really is one book, and we just subdivide it into 5. But if you treat that as one book, then who's the last person to die in the Pentateuch? Moses, who lived
120 years.
120 years. And so it's almost pointing to, like the ramp down in the years, it goes down to 120, and then Moses is godly man, but was punished when they were going to the promised land, but he lived 120 years. In fact, it says that Moses died while he was still healthy, because he wasn't allowed to go into the promised land, but he died at 120. So that's what you get into between those two statements. Is it an individual's life, or is it the length of the flood? That's why some people, somebody was telling me at the Ark Museum, that they say that it took about 70 to 80 years, I think is what they use for the how long it took to build the Ark. Is that correct? Okay. But other people say 120 years. The people that believe 120 years are arguing, okay, so it can't mean how long they live, because people live over 120 years, so what does it mean? And so now it's looked at, well, I'm going to contend with them, I'm going to put up with them, I'm going to whatever for 120 years, so that's how long it took. I'm only going to live 120 more years before I wipe them off the face of the earth with the flood. And so therefore it must have taken 120 years for Noah to build the ark. So that's where the 120 years comes from. So anyway, you can pick your side on that. I don't know if it has a huge amount to do with what the meaning is for us, but it is an interesting thing to consider in trying to figure. And again, Genesis is the king of this, for this book. There's just lots of stuff that's interesting to try to figure out. And so, which we should do, because often when we start digging into the trees, we get a better picture of what the forest is. We get a better idea of what the overall meaning is. But there's other times we start digging into the trees and start digging into detail that it's not as significant, and it really doesn't have an impact on what the big picture, what God's trying to tell us through the Bible. So we always look to try to figure out what it means, but then we have to decide if that is important in the proper interpretation of the book. So a lot of questions we have, they're always good to look into, but then we have to decide, does that in the end make a difference? And so that's why these are all good to evaluate. So continuing on our list of trouble spots in the Bible, the Nephilim were on the earth, both in those days and afterward. That by itself is fun, because how could they be on the, if we take the Nephilim as specific people, as the sons and daughters and daughters of men, you know, whatever, sons of God, daughters of men. If we take them as this special race, and we'll talk some more about this in a minute. If we're talking about them as being a special race, how could they live afterwards how many souls survived the flood?
With their families.
How many souls? 8 is the number. And 8. So, Nephilim could not have lived through the flood. But somehow they're also around afterwards. So is Nephilim talking about a race? Or is it talking about giants, which is the actual interpretation of the word and not the transliteration?
The footnote, this Bible said calls them the fallen ones.
Yeah.
Possibly the fallen ones.
Yeah. So some call the fallen ones, and then also giants is in there as well. So that's why it's a hard one to discern. The challenge with, and some people feel like you had the 10 generations before that Nephilim, the fallen, or it also can be royalty or leaders is another word that can be used there. And so we just had the 10 people in the generations of Seth. And so we can refer to the 10 great men of iniquity, which are the 10 men that we just saw in the generations listed of Adam. Adam, Seth, and so that genealogy that we went through. So the 10 great men of iniquity could be referenced. They're considered the 10 great men of iniquity. That could be the Nephilim, could be also an option for that. But there's also, when you get to Numbers 13:33, you have the appearance once again of Nephilim. So how do you deal with that word? Now that's kind of how Stillhammer walks through those first 4 verses. Then 5 through 8, simple enough, is just an introduction. Is kind of in between. Is the introduction to the flood narrative. When God's, and really it does speak more directly to what God's going to do. When he saw the wickedness of man was widespread on the earth, it looks like there's a queen right there, because when verse 1 is when man began to multiply. Right? Verse 5 is when the Lord saw that. So it looks like these are 2 different areas and treated different. Like the pericopes of my Bible have that split, and that's one of the reasons why. And you could also, I would argue, probably would be better off splitting the chapter there, because I would, y'all have learned, I'm generally 90% of the time going to decide to sit on. It just, to me, 5 to 8 makes more sense as the introduction, and I am very anti the idea that this is sons of God refer to angels. Get to that again in a minute, as we're going through the outline. So from there, we get to the Ross outline, and so the first 4 verses, God places a limit on the extent of human wickedness. It is interesting there, and there's a pattern here from the first 4 verses that you also see repeated in the second group of 4 verses, 5 through 8, which would cause you to think these 2 belong together because it's a repeated pattern. There's wickedness addressed in verses 1 and 2, oracle, God speaking, and then qualification in verse 4. Then 5 through 8, you have wickedness in verse 5. You have an oracle, emotional in verse 6, volitional in verse 7, and then qualification, Noah found grace in the eyes of God in verse 8. So that same pattern is good together, or is repeated in each of those. And so you have to factor those things in again, trying to figure out what exactly the passage is saying. One, by the way, just as an aside. So for the passage, I'm preaching 1 Samuel 24 on Sunday. And some people include chapters 22, 23, and 24, or 23 and 24 together as one unit. One of the commentaries. I mean, he argues in chapter 23 why it should be one unit, so in chapter 24 why it should be one unit, and he explains why this is one unit. He gives a bunch of reasons that are fascinating. And then goes, but you can also count 24, 25, and 26 as one unit, and separate it out from verse 23. And that's kind of how I feel like with this. Is like, well, it looks like 1 for 4 and 5 for 8 should be separated, but then when you look at the pattern being similar, maybe they are supposed to be somewhat together, maybe that's why they're in the transition, but there is a very distinct pattern, verses 1 through 4 and then 5 through 8. Now, corrupt practices. While humans are filling the earth as God commanded, evil was abounding. So basically, evil's just getting worse. And this is, I don't have enough time to do all this stuff.
I'm lost in the woods right now, so
All right,
be as simplistic as you can, I'll work it out. I mean, I just can't follow.
all right. So, well, so far, the biggest thing is, you gotta figure out how to address what is 1 through 4. Is it gonna be part of chapter 5 or part of chapter 6? If you consider it part of chapter 5, then basically this is just a summary of man being evil. And that sets up, we get the, Adam's sons, we see the genealogy, we see them going about life, but what's happened is they become evil. Then in verse 5, we get to, all right, now God's going to punish this evil because they're evil, God's going to punish them, and he regrets creating mankind, and so that introduces the flood. So that's the scenario we've talked about so far. Now, within that, you try to define the key terms, and there's just a lot of problems. I mean, there's just a lot of debate on the key terms in those verses, which is part of why this is hard to understand and to interpret properly.
It is scrambled eggs and brain.
So basically what we see is, the first two verses, the biggest thing we want to see is that man's becoming evil.
Man's becoming what?
Man is just become evil. So and so now we get to sons of God. There are 4 primary theories on who the sons of God are. First theory is that it's just simply the line of Seth. I've talked before about some people talk about Cain's the line of the devil, and so everybody in Cain's line is evil. And then there's the son of Seth, which is God's line, and so so the line of Seth is what it means by sons of God. So when you see that term sons of God there, it just means basically it's the line of Seth. Now remember, we talked about this some 5 and 6 also overlap a lot. So you also remember we talked about as you frame 6 in with 5, that's why we had to address it last week. God is the father of Adam, and then Adam is the father of Seth, and the father of, and father of, and father. So you have that whole theme of fathering building throughout all of chapter 5 into the first parts of chapter 6. So again, as you see it as part of the introduction, the sons of God would potentially be just maybe the fathers of the daughters. And part of the reason people say that is that since everyone's destroyed, it isn't like God sent the flood and just destroyed the line of Cain and he let the sign of Seth live. He destroyed everybody but Noah. So it's hard to argue that it's the line of, or that the line of Seth is good and the line of Cain is evil. But the main sense is men are going, I mean, there's evil, and then there's Charles Manson, Adolf Hitler, throw your person in there. Then there's just evil, right? Demonic evil. All right, so one of the, it's interesting reading Ross. He does not refer to, let me ask, how many people have always traditionally believed that these are angels? That the sons of God referred to in chapter 6 are angels? I got one.
Probably a lot out there.
Well, I was fascinated that,
I don't think I ever had an opinion one way or the other.
Okay.
Just didn't know.
I didn't know, I've always been very curious.
well,
It sounds like it's the people.
Ross keeps referring to the fact that one of the other theories is the most popular. And I've never, to me, I hear the angel thing more than I hear anything. So that was surprising me. Anyway, the idea of fallen angels comes from the idea that we have the fall of Satan in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 24, briefly mentioned in Luke 18. So you have the fall of Satan. And so the angels now, their job, their goal, spiritual battle, is to make man sin and to rebel against God the way that they did. That's where I was going to say you can't talk about anything. Studying this parallel to reading Tony Evans' systematic theology on spiritual warfare is absolutely an incredible side-by-side read. Because like all this stuff's going on, it's like, okay, here's how this plays out with spiritual warfare. You can't really understand spiritual warfare if you don't understand what's going on in early Genesis. It's been really interesting to kind of read those together. But trying to tie all that together is a lot. So, the problem is also, though, again, definitely the word there is going to be used, or anakim, some people say anakim, is used later in the Bible. They appear again. Anakim is Deuteronomy 1:28, also Deuteronomy 9:2, Joshua 11:21. It's referred to in Jude 6. That's where the people that most support this idea of the angels get their idea. So I do want to go back and read, to be fair to that position. Bill Milligan told me to make sure I was fair to his position tonight.
It is a little confusing, because at one place there are angels, and then in the middle there it says there are pagan kings.
Yes.
So,
Right, no, it's right. It's because you're trying to figure out which way to interpret the words into English,
Right.
because we don't have the, because we're not doing Hebrew. And even in Hebrew, there's questions over what's the proper interpretation. Jude says this in verse 6. Well, I'll move back to verse 5 to give you context of verse 6. Now, I want to remind you, although you came to know all these things once and for all, that Jesus saved the people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe, right? So he saved them, right? But then they wandered and that generation died out over 40 years. And the angels who did not keep their own position, but abandoned their dwelling, he has kept in eternal change in darkness for the judgment on that great day. Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns. So many people believe that Jude 6 is a reference to Genesis 6, and that that these were extremely evil angels that had children with women, and therefore God bound them specifically to hold them for the last days. And so that's where a lot of people get a tie in there. Now, if we go back to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 3. And we'll read a little more of this. All right, they'll exploit you in their greed. This is talking about false teachers. They'll exploit you with their greed, with made up stories. Their condemnation pronounced long ago is not idle. Their destruction does not sleep. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell and delivered them in chains of utter darkness to be kept for judgment, again, very similar wording to Jude, and if he didn't spare the ancient world by protecting Noah. So the idea is, if this is chronological, what we're reading through right now, then this must refer to the angels that had children with women. Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others when he brought the flood, when the world was ungodly, and if he reduced the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes and condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is coming to the ungodly. If he rescued the righteous Lot, distressed by the depraved behavior of the immoral. And so you see that is chronologically what book are we moving through? Genesis. So people believe that in 2 Peter is referring to the sons of God. What's that?
What's that 2 Peter reference?
2 Peter 3 through 10. And then you can't immediately say, well, he's cast everybody into hell and delivered them into chains until kept for judgment, because Satan still roams the earth. So it can't be that you're referring back to the fall of the angels necessarily there. So that's why 2 Peter seems to imply that it is angels. And then Jude 7, when we read that, it also deals with sexual sins and sins of sexual sins. So that's the argument, primary arguments for why people believe that the sons, and somebody's mentioned in Job, when it talks about one of the sons of God, that that's referring to angels. So there are times in the Old Testament that the phrase sons of God means angels. Now, here's the concerns with that. Jesus is talking about marriage in heaven, you know, the trick question about when there's 7 brothers and the first one dies and the second one dies, none of you know, the wife never has any children. Whose husband will she be in heaven? Right? And Jesus says what? That in heaven, man will be like angels, that they will neither be married or they will not be given in marriage. And so if they're not going to be given in marriage, then it would seem that angels, by the way, do not have a sexual function because there is no place where angels reproduce. So how is it that angels can reproduce? And so that's the concern. And again, God has destroyed all flesh. My argument has always been that if everyone, Romans is very clear that we're either descendants of Adam or descendants of, there's the first Adam and the second Adam. So we're sons of Adam, and then we become sons of Christ when we get saved. Everyone's a descendant of the son of Adam. If angels were able to come down here and get women pregnant, then there are people roaming the earth that were not sons of Adam. And did they inherit a sin nature? And so that to me has always been my biggest obstacle, is I do not believe, do they have a soul? Because they were not created by a man and a woman. They were created by an angel and a woman. And I think there's way too many scientific, biological questions for that, biblical questions for that to be the answer. So that's why I've never been a fan of that. Again, Jude and Peter seem to allude to it being that way. So that is, you've got to be able to deal with that too. And so those are that's the choices. This is not one of those things I'm dogmatic about, but certainly not salvific, but it is certainly something to consider and try to figure out what God's trying to tell us in Genesis.
So this lineage of family, whatever you want to call it, had offspring, so they should be wiped out for flood.
Yes. And yet this same word pops up again in Deuteronomy and in Numbers and in other places. So that's why there's the challenge. That's the other reason I argue it can't be angels, because I think it means something else other than that. So go ahead.
No, I'm trying to.
So here's the 4 options. So we've done 3 options. We've done the line of Seth. We've done fallen angels. Lesser gods within the pantheon. Now, quite honestly, the idea of lesser gods only makes sense in Greek mythology. Because there's how many gods? 1, right? Because false gods are not gods. There might be demons that come across as false gods, but there's only one God. So there are no other gods. So we'll dismiss that one pretty quick. The last one is despots or powerful rulers. It touches in with what John said, to where later on it talks that you can use the word that they were rulers. Did you say rulers?
Pagan kings.
Pagan kings, right? So the idea of pagan kings. So Ross actually, so that's the other one, is that the despots, they're just strong rulers. Ross actually likes a combination of 2 and 4. And this might make the most sense to me. So Daniel 10:13, there's 20 kingdoms. The earth had princesses that are being ruled by them. So there's this idea that there are these rulers, but they're evil, but they're also demonic forces. Michael has a fight in Ezekiel that looks like it would be potentially with a demonic force. So it may be why some kings in the Near East are described as divine, half divine, or demigods. And so the idea is not that they are gods, but that basically they are demon-possessed. All right, and then these demon-possessed people become leaders. Can demon possession give you more powerful strength?
Yes.
What story in the Bible gives us that?
The sons of Siva and the crippled man who jumped up on him and beat him.
Okay, good, I hadn't thought of that one, that's another very good one.
What about the?
The guy that couldn't be bound, the Legion, we are many, they couldn't bind him. And then he said they're common in his own right mind. So demons can have, they possess you, you can have supernatural, because angels are strong, right? Much more strong, much more powerful than men. And so that's the idea here, and that the sons of God, again, using the idea of Job 1:6 refers to angels. So, to be honest, I think that's probably the best answer. I would lean towards Ross's answer in that, because I really am anti their angels. But this idea that they were possessed by demons, became leaders, became rulers, and basically went beyond reasonable bounds of how they treated women. Some people say maybe this is the idea where a harem came into place, where it's supposed to be one man, one woman, and they start having harems and start mistreating women. That all kind of comes into play right here, because there's clearly something going on. With all this being said, there's clearly something going on in these first 4 verses that is extremely evil, beyond normal. I mean, I can say regular evil, but it's just something more grotesque than normal, and that's what we're dealing with.
Okay.
So they're not lesser gods, but they are actually potentially people that were demon possessed and had special, had stronger powers than those. So just as a summary, this means that humankind has overstepped the boundaries again, trying to assume the role. So notice this comparison. This is how Ross summarizes it. And I want us to think back to how Adam and Eve sinned. They tried to overstep their bounds by, right? Satan says, eat this, you'll be like God. They overstep their bounds and go beyond what they're supposed to do. And this is how Ross summarizes it. This means that humankind has overstepped the boundaries again, trying to assume the role of divinity and hoping to achieve immortality. God, through Moses, set the record straight by confronting the mythological idea directly. Do not believe the Gentile myths concerning the divine origin of men of renown. So don't consider it something crazy, something divine, but it's just men. In the end, all must die, because all are flesh. And ultimately, we're going to see with the flood what happens. Everyone dies, except for Noah, 3 sons, and their 4 spouses. And so that's the biggest part of those first couple of verses, is this idea of just the evil that's going on. Then you get to verse 3, and you start to see divine intervention. The Lord said, my spirit will not remain. The word there, a lot of translations say strive. Again, one of the reasons Job, by the way, is hard to interpret, to translate, is Hebrew. How many syllables are generally in the Hebrew word? I mean, that's letters of the alphabet. That's good. Number of syllables in a general word. Letters in a word. 3, correct, right? I mean, I'll say that every once. 3 letters and there's vowel points. Except Job is early Hebrew, because it was the first book written. Almost the entire book is written with 2 letters. So you basically got, when you go to unique words in a book, Job has more unique words than anywhere in the Bible, because they're all 2 letters. Or the majority of them are 2 letters. The word here that's used, that I'm going to strive with them or remain with mankind, I'm not going to do this forever, is used 1 time in the entire Old Testament. And that's right here. So there's nothing to compare it to help us fine-tune what the meaning is. And so again, so another word in the first 4 verses of this chapter that's hard to define is actually the word strive. Because it's the only place it's used. And then you get this idea of the 2 most common theories of 120. Again, depends on how you interpret it. If it's the number of the number of years man's going to live, Selhammer's against that, because there's people that live over 120 years after that, other people as well. But such a short life comparison with long lives. The previous chapter makes the fall of section humans, the fall and separation of human beings from their Creator. So, it goes back to, it's more of a summary. So it's not just the number of years that man will live. The problem, so the challenge with that is, once you start doing the math on the flood, the idea that it's 70 to 90 years old, 90 years to build the flood the ark makes more sense. That's where they get the 70 to 90 years at the ark. They go through the years that people live and all that kind of stuff, and they go through and do the math, and that's what they come up with. So all of this is hard to put together. And so again, some people say it's the number of years to the flood. And again, because of the length of lives, that's why people say it's the best, because people lived over 120 years after this. It's the most defendable position because people clearly lived over 120 years.
Could it have ever been an average, like life expectancy?
Well, I mean, the idea is I'm not gonna let you live over 120 years. I'm not gonna, well, that comes back to what is contend, is strive or contend or whatever. If that means I'm not gonna let man live past 120 years, then it's talking about lifespan. So that's how most people interpret it. But others will say, because you can't call it lifespan because so many people live past 120 years when we look at the next genealogies. So now what does it mean if it doesn't mean lifespan? I would argue, I still think that it's a thematic building throughout the book, because the reason Moses' 120 years is cut off, why? Because he physically died and his body wore out? No, because it's punishment of sin, and so therefore he couldn't enter the promised land. And so this idea of 120 years, I'm not going to contend for man, he's not going to live 120 years, is because it's a punishment for sin. And so I think you got the transition to 120 with Moses, people living longer, and we talked about some last week, this idea of when the ages started dropping. And so I think the best interpretation is 120. But the biggest thing is God dealing with man in their sin, because God has to contend with sin. God has to deal with the sin of man, and man continues to get worse because left to his own, this is contrary to modern day psychology, contrary to modern belief by a lot of people. Man is not good, and man left to his own does not get better. Man gets darker and darker and darker and darker without God. By the way, I'd argue we saw that last week in 2 Samuel when we talked about David and Saul, because Saul ends up killing the priest, right? And then Doeg ends up killing the priest and then the whole town, including the women and children. I mean, it spun deep. How dark is man? I mean, you're killing a priest, a city of priests, and you wipe out the entire city because Nob was a collection of cities. I mean, it's crazy. And so man of his own were evil. There's a great line that Charles Spurgeon has. The seed of every sin is in every man's heart. And a lot of us don't like to think about that. That means any sin anybody commits is in all of our hearts. But it's the grace of God that spares us. There's nothing inherently good about me. I am only good because God has worked in my life. And it kind of points to that, because God is going to not contend with man anymore.
Suddenly, MacArthur says it's 120 years to the flood.
He was on the flood side.
Yeah, my study and everything here, what they tell me here says it's kind of like, we're in pure grace now. That was the period of grace then.
Until,
Yeah.
that much time.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that's
that makes sense to me.
yeah. Well, that is one of the most common things to get this 100. So you can choose 120 years of man, 120 years of flood. The biggest thing is God has to deal with sin. Which, by the way, now I'm on the other thing. I'm on. I finished spiritual warfare, and now I'm working on salvation. And I think today and tomorrow is justification, and about the idea of legally we are guilty of sin, and God had to find a way to be just and justify it. Romans. He had to be just that he dealt with sin, but he also got to find a way to justify us so that we can be saved. So anyway, that comes back to here. Everything in the Bible, first 11 chapters. All right, 5 through 7. God's plan to destroy the entire world because of pervasive wickedness of the human being. Basically, verse 5, we see corrupt hearts. Saw that man's wickedness was widespread on the earth. Every inclination of the human mind was nothing. I just want to tell you, Japanese restaurant on Sunday. We ate for lunch there. And Barbara made me face the TV. And it was, they were showing the Gay Pride March in New York City live. And so for 40 minutes, I'm watching the Gay Pride thing. I mean, I'm not watching it intently, but my eyes are all, I mean, that's just what's there. We're the closest booth. I can even watch other people. We're the closest booth to the TV. And man, I told Barbara when my stomach hurt. She goes, "Gee, too much?" I said, "No, I had to watch it mess for 30 minutes." And just some of the depravity. They interviewed some girl that was a Christian singer, and now she's like extremely pro LGBTQ and how she found love, the people loved her, and she couldn't find love in the church. And which, by the way, how do people know that we're love, right? That's how the people recognize the church and that we're disciples of Christ is through our love. And anyway, she's talking about the love that she finds, and I mean, just and I mean, it's just 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes that would just wear you out, because I mean, you can tell what you're looking at the whole time. I mean, it's just
Demonic.
it is. It's demonic. It's just, and that's wickedness was widespread on the earth, and the inclination of human mind was nothing but evil all the time. I mean, that's it's the world.
Change.
It's the world we live in. You're right. The world, man still. I mean, it's just by the grace of God, but man is still evil at the core. It's who we are.
I was going to ask you that question. What you think? Are we any different prior to the flood? Now?
No, we're just, the seed of every man. The seed of every sin is in every man's heart. Has been from the beginning. No, I think we're all. I mean, we are evil, but by the grace of God.
He destroyed all the people in the flood, but we've gone back the same way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, we get to Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, how quick does that happen? I mean,
Well, actually,
it's just amazing.
It didn't go away with Noah.
What's that?
With Noah, it didn't actually go away.
Well, that.
It was less of the evils.
How many of y'all have seen Noah? Is anybody else going to go see Noah before they quit doing it at the Sight and Sound Theater? Anybody else going to go before it's over?
You know, we've seen.
We've seen it.
Oh, so. Anyway, the way they deal with this is, I'm just telling you, dead on. It was the best part of this. Why? Those things are just anyway, they're incredible. I spent a lot of time reflecting on Noah after watching. But they hit this. I mean, it's like, and Noah's even frustrated because it's great. They have a fight between two of the sons on the boat, on the ark. And he's like, why are we still fighting? Because God's left just the 8 of us here, but there's still sin. This is not cured. It was great. Because it's dead on, it's who we are. Minus the grace of God, that is who we are. And we still, as Paul says, we fight that. The things I do, I don't want to do. The things I don't want to do, those are the things that I do. Because we have to fight this fleshly nature all the time.
So it's human nature to sin then.
It is. And the only thing that stops us is the grace of God. Regretted that he had, we ain't touching that. I'm just telling you, there ain't a verse in this, there ain't not a verse in this that we've read that I hadn't had 2, 3, 4 hour debates of. Regretted made man on earth. He was deeply grieved. He's going to wipe away mankind. And so the corrupted hearts in verse 5, there's wickedness is everywhere. Ross says it this way: God has made human beings by design. They had taken their God-given capacities and devised, the God-given capacities, because we're His image, but devised evil continually. There is hardly a stronger statement in the Bible about the evil of the human heart. The knowledge of good and evil has led to this low point. So, when we talk about verse 5, it talks about in Genesis 1, God prepares a land for man. God is now the one that takes the good land from the man when they act corruptly. So God gives the good land, right? Because every day it is good. And now He's going to take that good land away because of their evil. The cause of the flood is directly to man's not doing good after receiving the knowledge. So they received the knowledge of good and evil, and instead of choosing to do good, they chose to do evil continually. So God's creation was good. After humans must find it on their own, what God sees is not His creation as good, rather He saw the evil of man.
So mankind has a problem with this thing called work, so we have to.
So now divine intervention gives response, comes in 2 parts. Verse 6 is the pain. The Lord regretted He made man, right? So it's an emotional response by God. And then verse 7, he talks about the fact that He's sorry that He's made man, He's grieved, which is actually a very interesting parallel with Matthew 5:29, which we won't go into. Pain came into the world by sin, and God is now pained by the sin. And so God is sorry. Verse 7 deals more with God's action to that. And in action, so the first part's emotional, then it's action-oriented. God's going to deal with this pain, literally blot out, completely remove. The word there can be translated blot out, complete removal of one from another. Like God's outrage in Israel in Exodus 32, when they sinned with the golden calf, God is going to blot out Interesting, by the way, that they use that term here, and then Moses is writing to the Israelites that sin with the golden calf, and it says that God will blot out those, you know, so he's telling them the same word. God wanted to do the same thing the Israelites he did right here, and remove them. But he also did what? He showed grace.
But it didn't say regret it.
Didn't say regret it.
That's the big,
Well, no,
go ahead.
well, no, so the interesting note, because getting into the subtlety of that, it's very interesting, because this is when you get into the Calvinism Armenian thing, and that's why I have to run from this. So what you get is, in the next verse that Leonard, is it says God relented, which is actually properly translated repented, which means God changed his mind. And so God regretted here, you can say God changed his mind. The literal interpretation of that, best interpretation of the word repent, not relent. But even if he relented, it means God went from, I'm not going to destroy the Israelites, okay, I'm not going to do that now, which implies God changed his mind. How does a God that knows everything change his mind? We don't have time for that tonight. But that's why we get into the regret. It's the similar argument, because it's this idea of God's grace overcomes what he should do. That's the part I hope you see. God's grace is incredible, because what God should do is remove us from the earth. God should blot us out because of our evil. But God's grace, in chapter 6 of Genesis, in Exodus 32, he decides not, he shows grace and mercy to somebody that deserved to be blotted out. And I think as longer-term Christians, which I think would apply to pretty much everybody, as people that have been saved for a long time, I think sometimes we lose how remarkable it is that God saved us. And we lose that David in Psalm 51, restore to me the joy of my salvation. When David realizes that God's Spirit has come upon him, and the joy I had in that moment when I knew you, because I recognized that I was evil, bring that back to me because I've sinned against you. Remind me of how much I needed you and your grace. And bring that joy back to me. Okay.
If you get real simplistic, if you knew all this was going to happen, it's like you did. And you
We
read
made a
it.
hard road, didn't we?
Why did he even make man? Because he knew this was going to happen when he created man.
You want the Calvinist answer?
Oh, I don't care. I know.
No, it is, you don't, how do you know you had a good day or a bad day? What makes you appreciate the good days? When you have a bad day, right?
Yeah.
It helps you to recognize the glory of God, that he can take evil and still show his glory through that. God overcomes the evil man, overcomes what he tried to create, overcomes all of that, is a way to show God's glory in a greater way.
So why did he need man?
He doesn't need man.
He did. I mean, it seems like,
He wanted.
why did he want man?
It shows his glory.
Right, but
It shows his glory.
He get kind of
if
lonely.
I was going to, and I understand, he can say, well, you know, I'm going to have a bunch of people going to follow me around no matter what.
Which is what's going to happen in heaven.
Yeah. But, you know, just think about it, like I said, very simplistic terms, and somebody going, well, man's evil, inherently evil. God knew this was going to happen. So why did God create people who were going to be evil to worship him?
Let me I'll give you the number one pastor answer.
Choice.
I can never answer a God why question.
Okay. That's what I said, because
I'm just saying, there's no.
The same reason he made horse bodies.
they mean something.
But you just
They
said
feed off of me, of course.
in heaven, people are gonna be following him around in heaven.
That's
If
correct.
he hadn't created man, then it would never be.
Heaven.
But he didn't need to have people. He doesn't need.
He doesn't need it. How does that glorify him? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I was saying, it's,
No way, no.
you know, you created to worship him.
And this is the finite mind of man trying to figure out
grace.
The infinite mind of God, it can't be done.
Even going back to what you said about Moses, at 120, he died. He was healthy, but he died. It was his punishment. How do you call that punishment when then you spend eternity in heaven? I mean,
Yeah.
it was
Right,
punishment in
right,
the
right.
eyes of man.
But it's
Yeah.
it's written as a punishment. You are not entering the promised land because you sin. So it's very, the Bible intends for us to take it. I understand that. Also, you don't immediately go in the presence of God if you're Moses, because he has to go to Sheol and wait for Christ to return. So he got a 1,000 years or so to have to wait before he actually gets.
You don't earn your way in heaven, it's something about faith.
I think God need to change it, man.
And anyway, that would actually work with some of the spiritual battle stuff I read.
Just
All right.
like lonely in there.
All right, God 8, verse 8, Noah, however, faith favored, found grace with the Lord. God provides grace to escape great judgment. Just real quick, grace signifies a merited favor. So because we find out Noah is a righteous man later, does not mean that God, Noah being righteous, is why he earned God's favor. In fact, so grace signifies a merited favor. If the word is given its proper meaning, it means that the recipients of grace deserve the judgment too. So Noah and his son deserve to be dead also. By the way, another great job, that's like saying Noah, the way they did that, particularly with Shem. Here, Noah received sovereign grace and escaped the catastrophe. No one escapes divine judgment apart from grace. God's people are recipients of grace. They are spared from the divine wrath of the wicked. At the time of Moses, Israel knew they were chosen by God and recipients of his favor. They too would fall under the judgment of God if they indulged in sexual idolatry of the pagans, which they do because they don't trust God, they fall before they get in, and then they end up being exiled because they were following false gods. Message of the New Testament parallels Genesis 6-8, is that the corrupt world will be swept away by judgment before God's remnant will bring new order. Just a summary of the chapter stresses the significance of man's, or these verses stress the significance of man's rebellion and God's coming judgment of sin. The wickedness of pagan idolatry and fornication, in spite of their claims, brings pain to God and judgment on the world. A judgment that can be escaped only by God's grace.
Will you go back to where you said the corrupt world will be swept away by judgment? What did you say right before that? Something of the New Testament.
New Testament, let's see. The New Testament that parallels Genesis 6-8 is that corrupt world will be swept away by judgment before God's remnant will begin a new order. And the cross-reference for that is Matthew 24:37-39.
And could you reread your last sentence again?
The wickedness of pagan idolatry and fornication, in spite of their claims, tell me that's not true, brings pain to God and judgment to the world. A judgment that can can escape only by God's grace. It is really, you go to Romans 1, and just God turned them over to the depravity of their mind to let people become more and more depraved. I mean, it's everything in the Bible is in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, or is at least referred to and built on. I know those are 8 hard verses.
So long as that.
There's just what the part of it is there are so many. How you define all the different words gives you a lot of different. So you got like 9,000 branches of what's the right interpretation based on how do you interpret these words. Is the Nephilim, is that angels or is that men? And is it, he's going to withhold his judgment on man, or however you want to use the word, for 120 years. He's not going to remain with mankind forever. There's 120 years. Well, it's 120 years of the flood, or is it 120 years how long they're going to live? So there's just so much that's difficult to
What's the word
discern.
for regret? I mean, I wonder about the Greek or Hebrew context
Hebrew.
and the actual word. Is it something, to get a word to translate to regret, that could mean a lot of things.
Leonard, were you the one who brought up the
Yeah,
Sunday school
because there was
Sunday?
something Sunday we mentioned, I thought, that's something that's always in my mind, like, God, regretting doing something, sounds a little bit.
But I don't think you have to be surprised to regret something.
Yeah.
I agree with
I
that.
mean,
That's
his feeling, his being, his heart was hurt by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he can regret.
And I will say,
If he can love, he can regret.
And we always say, I'm gonna regret this, but.
Ross's interpretation of that word, instead of being translated regret, is actually sorry.
Yeah, I saw that.
Sorry makes more, so again, is regret the better English word, or sorry, and
Regret
again,
sounds more like I made a mistake.
yes.
Sorry
Which is how
is
you
like
get
I
it.
wish, I wish this.
The regret, if you think regret as I made a mistake, then that draws you a parallel with relent. If you take I'm just sorry, then all of us can say to I'm sorry, but
I'm sorry.
it's just got, you
I
know,
wish it had, but I don't regret doing it.
yeah,
But God's mercy and his righteousness coexist,
yes.
and they are, at odds with each other at some times. And I
Well,
guess
it
unlike
really does
man-
get to, it gets to the whole thing, when again, if you get the whole Calvinism Arminian thing, is it, do you choose, do you show faith, or does God save you, and by God already saving you, then you choose faith? And
That's the
only God knows, because there's different passages in Scripture that are just at tension with one another, to where we don't understand it, but God does. And I think sometimes you just can't explain it. Because if that Calvinism Arminian thing had been solved in the last 300 years with, hey, this is the right answer, it'd been solved by now. But it's still raging. Tearing up Southern Baptist churches all over the country, by the way. It's actually the biggest fight in Southern Baptist Convention right now is within churches in a lot of places. Or 5 years ago it was, maybe not now, but it was the Calvinism versus Arminianism thing.
You just answered two things that I said. One, I was going to say, what happened over all these years that we really hadn't nailed this down as far as the interpretation. The other, the only answer is faith.
Well, I think it goes to what Debbie says too. God's mind is so much above ours, we can't get our human minds around how God works. It's why, how many names are there for God in the Bible? Right? Henry Blackaby does a list. It's like 4 pages, single space, small font. Why is that? Because it takes us 3 pages, single name, to try to describe who God is. We can't do it in language because you're trying to hit the different aspects of God. Even Jesus, wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, right? Great passage. Handles Messiah. Why do we use all those words? Because every single one of those is needed to try to describe completely who Jesus is. And so there's a lot of stuff we struggle with. Okay. I try not to run over too much. But the most we run over is on 8 verses. All right. Let's pray. Dear God, we come forward tonight again just to praise you as God. We praise you because you understand this. We thank you that you gave us your word to try to figure out. God, hopefully the biggest thing is it gives us an appreciation for your holiness and our sinfulness without your grace and mercy. Let us never be arrogant, that we don't sin like somebody else. We've just been blessed by where you placed us and how you worked in our life. Let us never think that it's anything besides finding favor, finding grace in your eyes. And so God, just remind us of that tonight. Remind us of how depraved we can be if we don't walk with you and we don't strive to live through the power of your Holy Spirit. So in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.